You've brought up the idea of power a couple of times, and I appreciate your stance because I think it's easy to go like power is bad, right? And just and you seem to actually be going, look, this is a thing that happens when you haven't someone who's working for you, or when you are the decision maker in a team, or whatever. Like you have power, and I want to talk more about that and what you actually see, what happens there.
I mean, it's different for everybody, right? Like, some people adapt really well to a leadership role. It's very natural or seemingly very natural to them. It doesn't mean that they're not freaking out underneath, but like they handle it well. I guess for me, I'd measure it in terms of like resilience, of like how resilient is that person and how well are they at kind of staying calm and making decisions under pressure. So I think a lot of that comes back to resilience and how do we create more resilient people. But it can go either way. Some people really love it and are successful and just naturally very good at it and do it with empathy. Others are terrified. I know for me, I spent a lot of time feeling really scared, really terrified to make decisions. Worried about I'm a people pleaser, and want people to be happy and healthy, and kind of taking on a lot of that baggage. I remember kind of a colleague being like, "Oh, I'm going to have a child," and my brain was like, "How do I make this studio now last and for 18 years? I've got to get that kid to college." And I remember at that time, like I was like, "That's fantastic, that's amazing." And in the back of my brain, I was like, "Okay, how do I keep this going now for 18 years? Because now I'm going to be I'm raising this child." And I remember, having this conversation with myself, and being like, "It's not your baby. Like it's you have to." You gotta cut yourself some slack. Like you can't control everything. You can't plan this child's future. Much as I want everything to be successful and them to be happy, but I realized how much I took on of like that responsibility, and it was way too much. It was way too personal. So that was my experience. And then others, like you say, they don't adapt well to it, and we get I think control and power come hand in hand. So you either get those that embrace power and start to understand and maybe are a bit afraid of it and realize what's going on. And then you get others that are afraid of it in a different way, and so that control becomes the focus. And that's where you get all of the mistakes being made very fast in succession. And if we're lucky, they learn from those, and that makes them ultimately, hopefully, a better leader. And some don't. Some continue to make the same mistakes and double down, because that control is ultimately what they think leadership is about. It's about, I tell you what to do, you do it, rather than like power. There's a, what's it called? There's like a power effect. I forget the name of it, but there's this kind of like idea of like power takes time to gain, but like you lose power so much more quickly than you gain it. And that makes people nervous because they see the failures, they see people lose and fall from grace, and that control then can tighten. So I think you've got something on every end of the spectrum, and people are going to just kind of respond how they respond, and that will depend on so much, right? That will depend on the baggage that they're bringing, both personal, both from their previous workplace experience, who they are as people, their natural kind of characteristics, their strengths and their weaknesses. It's much more complicated, like in terms of predicting how people are going to respond. And like I said, until you're in that position, I think it is hard to predict.
You don't know what you'll do.
No, no. I think there are things that you can do, and we can talk about that obviously in the sense of like those that have already found themselves in that space. Like what are the things that you can do to remain on top of that? And there are definitely, it comes back to again being messy. We're all messy. That's just part of being human, and but we have to kind of notice that and accept some of that. And so I think, for me, some of the best leaders that I work with are those that kind of know how messy they are, and kind of embrace that in a way of like, I'm going to learn more about it. I'm going to not ignore it. Again, it comes from that learning, reframing that kind of space of like, oh, I fucked up really badly. How can I learn from that experience rather than just bulldoze on and keep going? And for me, that's the difference.
There was a leader at a small startup that I worked with briefly, and he came to mind as you were talking. He really wanted to start a very healthy company, and he'd gotten some funding, and he pulled together some very, human-centric leaders around him in his various craft discipline roles. And as time went on and things weren't going the way he wanted, and it was really his idea, his project, his company, even though he had some other founders around him, he sort of just started bulldozing everybody else's decisions. And I remember chatting with him about it, and I said, look, you hired a bunch of people that value autonomy and agency and are trying to create that inside of your organization to maximize the chance of success. But you're now behaving in a way where you're the sole decider and the idea holder. Now, look, I'm not going to tell you there haven't been successful companies that have operated that way. Not where I'd want to work, but hey, some companies have succeeded. But you've basically bait and switched all your founders and a lot of your employees because they came here because you pitched them, I want to create what I think would be a really healthy company, and that implies all these different things, and I'm going to do that the right way. But when the rubber meets the road, the reality is that you'll undo anything they do that you don't like. And to your point around, like, suddenly it became about, I need to control this project. I need to control this company. I need to control this game. And I said, like, again, I'm not a fan of that style. I don't think it works as well. I think you have a lower chance of success. But, hey, I'm not going to tell you there's no one who's ever done that hasn't succeeded. They have. I would say you have the wrong employees for that. And that's a huge problem that you have right now. And it was interesting. I don't think it worked out very well. His intention was so good at the start.
Yeah. I mean, totally normal. Totally normal. Because, and it comes back to, I mentioned resilience plays a part in this. I don't think the majority of founders realize how much pressure being a founder is,
Yeah.
that, and the pressure comes from all sorts of different places, right? It comes from how you structure the team. Have you structured the team so that they all come to you? I see so many founders create a bottleneck, and they're now this kind of source where all decision making now has to run through them, and that happens through various reasons, like maybe they haven't delegated, maybe at the start it was just 3 people and that worked really well, but now it's 50 people, and now 50 people coming through you just doesn't work in the same way. Or maybe it's a control thing. Maybe it's like, nope, this is my baby, I own it, it's mine, and this kind of sense of ownership comes into play. So it's very much about like, I cannot allow anybody into that space because that somehow demeans what I'm doing as a founder. So in this situation, I don't know. There's a couple of, like I said, there's a couple of different ways in which founders get there, and I think we just have to be aware of the amount of pressure that's being put on them. How do we get out of that? It's going to depend on a number of different things. It will depend on like how willing the founder is to let go of control. It will be, what is the founder capable of seeing in that moment?